I have the great honour of introducing our speaker this evening, Suzanne Preston Blier. Suzanne is the Alan Whitehill Clowes Professor of Fine Arts and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. She is an authority, actually that's not true at all, she is the authority on the cultures of West Africa and the continent more generally, especially the Yoruba of Ile-Ife, the Batam Maliba of northern Togo, and the peoples of the Babaie Kingdom in the Republic of Benin. For her scholarship on the art of Ife in particular, she was honoured the year before last, I think, in Nigeria, with the Yoruba chieftaincy title, Otin Iyeye Oba Lofa. Talking personally, I first encountered Suzanne's work as an undergraduate 20-something years ago. I remember reading her now very famous article on ivory and African perceptions of the Portuguese around 1492, and I remember very clearly having my entire world turned upside down. It was an article that came out in the early 90s in Art Bulletin, I know it came out in Art Bulletin. And the world was turned upside down precisely because it imagined an art history that could be orientated from Congo, from Benin, from Sierra Leone, looking outwards, which is so unlike the art history that I had encountered, in which those kingdoms were looked at, in a sense, from Europe. So, if nothing else, at a personal level, it has been 20 years that I've wanted Suzanne to join us at the Courtauld, and we are very delighted to have her here this evening. Staying with that particular article, and to give you a sense of her importance to our discipline, that article was selected in 2011 when publishing the Art Bulletin Centennial Anthology as one of the 33 most important art historical articles of the last century. What is more, Suzanne had two articles amongst the 33 most important articles of the last century to be published in that anthology. She was one of only 3 scholars, and notably the only woman to have that honour, the other 2 being Meyer Shapiro and Leo Steinberg. Suzanne's scholarship has, of course, continued to stimulate and to challenge us all, whether we work on sculpture or architecture, whether we work on the Middle Ages or on modernity. Like so many Africanists, she is not constrained by Eurocentric ideas of period and of medium in quite the same way. The number of books and articles she has published is quite staggering. I couldn't print them out. It just went on and on and on. And I don't know if she ever really sleeps, but she can't, I imagine, from this list. But they include The Anatomy of Architecture, Ontology and Metaphor in Bantam Maliba Architectural Expression, which came up with Cambridge in 1987, African Vodun, Art Psychology, Architecture in West Africa, sorry, I got that wrong. African Vodun, Art Psychology and Power, that came out in 1995, African Royal Art, The Majesty of Form, 1998, Batuba, Adobe Architecture in West Africa, that came out in 2004, Art and Risk in Ancient Yoruba, Ife History, Power and Identity circa 1300. They came up with Cambridge a few years ago in 2015. And then 2 books, not one, but 2 that are coming out. Or one has come out, another one will come out later this year. One with a press in Switzerland called Les Anciennes, and another one with the Duke University Press on Picasso's Demoiselles, The True Origins of a Modern Art Masterpiece, which you have to be incredibly brave to take on the Demoiselle, but she seems to be going to overturn many aspects of how we understand that work about. Most intriguingly, in the next few years, we're expecting a book to come out with Yale Press, which has the most engaging title, 1325, How Medieval Africa Made the World Modern. Suzanne has had more fellowships than I can name or list this evening, and her books have rightly received more awards than I can really tell you about, given how prolific she is as a scholar, and above all how rigorous and probing her scholarship is. It is hardly a surprise that they have been so lauded. She is above all, and this is hugely important to me at least, she is above all an art historian. by which I mean that her approach, while often interdisciplinary, and nonetheless confronts questions of representation and material, aesthetics and form, which remain absolutely central and key to art history. She is therefore an immensely important advocate for our discipline, both through her scholarship, which I've tried to give you some flavour of, and also in her administrative work. She was, after all, the president of CAA for 2 years, between 2016 and 2018, and is a member of the National Committee for the History of Art. She's also, on a more techie side, the chair of the International Advisory Committee for World Map, which is hosted by Harvard, I understand, an electronic interactive mapping database, which is a particular part on Africa, which if you haven't already used, I strongly recommend to all of you. So this evening, she's going to be talking to us about a Coptic centre in medieval West Africa, reframing Prester John and early global trade. Suzanne.
Thank you so much. It's such a real honor to be here. And just seeing the array of other talks that you're going to enjoy on pre-colonial Africa, it is really astonishing and really wonderful at this heart, this center, this historic framing site for the whole history of art. To have Africa being received and engaged in this way is incredibly warming, certainly for me and I think everyone else in the field. Let me begin by telling you that this may be a controversial talk. This is one that I've been working on for a number of years. And in some ways, I think it is not only controversial, but also in many respects transformative, not only from some of the issues raised, but from some of the methodological ways that I'm exploring this. But let me move on specifically to it. First, I want to frame it just for a few minutes on how I got to this point and where ultimately we're going. In the introduction, there was a mention made of my book on Ile Ife, and I won't really address that material here, but I'll hint at it. And the book that I'm working on now was originally going to be the story of these two remarkable men, the Emperor of Mali, Mansa Musa, who on the Hajj spent or gave away so much gold that he caused a global economic crisis that actually impacted the Florentine banking houses. And while on the Hajj in Mecca, he met the son of the head of the perfume and spice trade from Granada. He himself was a lawyer and a poet and a calligrapher, and the two became close friends, and Es Saheli from Granada came back with Mansa Musa to Mali and was his court architect, helping to build, among other structures, the Jingeri Bear Mosque in Timbuktu, which is still extant today. So that book is really about the year 1325, the end of a revolution that I've been working on and through sort of discovery and the impact of what I'm seeing as Africa on the global sphere, particularly in this 1325 period. But along the way, I began to realize that there were a series of things that I was seeing through various forms of evidence in the middle of Africa, in what is today Nigeria and adjacent countries of Chad and Cameroon, that make me really want to rethink the whole history of Christianity in this part of the world. And you can see these hints through various articles, but also through various artworks and artifacts. One of the most important is this article on Christian traces in a Franciscan mission by Gray, which basically tells the story of a ship off the coast of Tripoli with some Franciscan priests. They ring the bell, call to prayer, and a group of Africans who are enslaved go to the service. And the priests are really shocked to see them there, but they discover that they are in fact Christian, and they move, I guess, eventually to Italy, and the Pope decides he's really curious about this great center of Christianity in the heart of Africa, and sent a delegation down across Libya and into the area of what is Chad and down toward Nigeria, but they never make it. So it's a kind of one of those stories that we're missing the end, but it's an important tale in its own right. And then we have a rather strange kind of mythical thing that has happened in the early 20th century with a famous German traveler, Leo Frobenius, who went to what is today Nigeria, to the city of Ile-Ife, and made a remarkable discovery of a group of bronzes and terracottas. It was a kind of German-English contestation as well as was happening in that period. And he sent a telegram to the New York Times, or rather his father did, saying that he had found the lost Atlantis, which is a good discovery, I think, for anyone to make at any particular point. And it has been the bane of existence of African scholars ever since, and has been the focal point of people saying, rightly so, we have great arts in Nigeria, and you're claiming it was a lost Atlantis. There's, somehow people from the classical world were able to go underground and survive until the medieval period when these things were made. But I think that there is an important link, and that too to the Coptic era and Christianity, and that is the Copts, the Christians in Egypt and Sudan, were actually communicating through textiles and other arts, as well as sculptures, ideas about the ancient world, as the Byzantines and others had done as well. And I think some of those, we'll see by the end, are also reaching here. And from the same period and later, we also have references to the site of Ife as a place where you've got Christian iconography, whether it's priestly stoles, as in the figure second from the right, or whether they're wearing crosses or other things that make one, and it's basically within the association of the site itself, that you begin to wonder, well, what is happening here, and what is the longer history of it? And we have other evidence as well that come together to make, I think, an interesting point on this. One is the famous Catalan map of 1375. And nearly all of us have focused our attention, rightly so, on the famous Mansa Musa, who at that point controlled nearly all of the gold that was coming into Europe and into parts of the Middle East in this period at a time when Europe has turned to gold. But right beside him, to his east, is another king, the king of Organa. And that really is an interesting identifier, because it seems quite possible that this king of Organa is a reference to the king of Ife, whose title is the Ogane. It's the title of rulership, of chieftaincy, and we see that here in this 1554 Munster map as well, replete with a crown and a reference to rulership, alongside this rather strange-looking single-eyed being, which on the one hand is pretty characteristic of many medieval and early modern maps of this part of Africa. There's strange beings being defined, but it also coincides in some respects with the type of crown that the Oni of Ife, the king of Ife, would wear, that has a singular sort of eye-like element that is reflected in the middle of it. And that, to some degree, takes us to the larger issue of Prester John, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but simply to say the decision to identify Prester John pretty much exclusively with Ethiopia was relatively late. Early on, people were thinking that this king who was Christian may have been in some part of West Africa, or later in India. And then finally, Ethiopia, of course, made the most sense based on the longevity of Christianity there. But early maps, such as the famous Prester John map of the 16th century, convey some of this sort of cross-currency about where this place was. Nubia is considerably to the west from what we see it today, very close to Lake Chad, consistent with what I'm going to be arguing is a major east-west route between Nigeria and the Nile, basically Lake Chad further to the east. And in this area, I think, emerged a wide variety of things that became important. The other thing that's quite striking here is this idea that somehow a Lake Niger, or a Niger River, that runs underground from what is today the Niger River to the Nile is also important, and we'll see that there's some, indeed, some validation for that belief when we look at some of these maps. But the first question, what is the evidence for Christianity? How do we identify Christianity in the remains, archaeological or even living remains of this area? Buildings are relatively little help, except if they're made out of stone, as places like Lalibela are in Ethiopia. But even in Ethiopia and places to the east, Christian centers, temples, places of worship often take the form of vernacular architecture of the area, round circular houses, as in the Coptic church on the left, sometimes made of earth and other materials, not so dissimilar from what one would find in places such as the Nupe area of Nigeria. One thing, however, that I do think is quite important in terms of identifying Christianity are bells. Bells are one of the most important items that not only announce religious services, but also take on another role as well, other roles as well, from the vantage point not only of church services, but also in some cases things such as ritual elements. And one of the things that early on struck me about this part of Nigeria, which is the sort of south central area of what is Nigeria today, is the importance of these pyramidal shaped bells, sometimes footed, with 4 feet on each side. And I would simply say that bells are not something that one characteristically finds in sub-Saharan Africa, much less bells that go back a number of centuries. In Ethiopia, the principal bells are stone that are struck. So there too, it's a very different phenomenon. And the fact that this kind of pyramidal bell is so distinctive in Byzantine bells of the 7th through 10th century, I think is quite important and could easily have been transported. The center of Ile-Ife was a major center in this period and would have been a heartland that would have attracted people of a broader global sphere, and indeed did. It was also a major center of manufacturing, creating some of the most extraordinary artworks I think ever made anywhere. These pure copper masks, such as the one on the left of King Obalufon, is almost paper thin, and the fact that it has very few trace elements in it made the very technology of casting through the lost wax method enormously difficult. It is a local manufactured object, and yet there are other works as well that have copper as well as various other trace elements, minerals, zinc, and otherwise, such as the figure in the center, which was identified today because it was preserved through ritual, reburied year after year during ceremonies, as Olokun, the sea god, who was also identified in oral traditions as the minister of finance. The sea, the river, being the means through which one would be able to achieve a number of great kinds of trading goods per se. Among the things that were manufactured here that Ibn Battuta, who wrote about his travels to Mali, speaks about for this center to the east of Mali, is that it was a place of enormous wealth. Indeed, this king was identified as perhaps even wealthier than the king of Mali, and one of the things they made their fortune on was the manufacturing of glass. If one looks at the chemistry of this glass, including the blue-green dichroic beads, which means they change color in sunlight, this is one of those places, a few places on the globe, where glass making is said to have originated. Korea is another, and then I believe it's Italy is a third. Now, whether this was entirely a local invention or whether it's an appropriation of a technology from elsewhere that is kind of refashioned locally is not clear, but it was definitely a center for the manufacturing of beads, which were then transported broadly, reaching places such as Timbuktu. It also is a center for the harvesting of silkworms, which makes it very clear, and that is done in a community which was the royal refuge town for rulers who had to leave the capital. It's a hillside community. And this means that Ife in this period of roughly 1300 was part of the Silk Road. And we shouldn't be surprised. West Africa, Africa more generally, was a place of enormous wealth. And by 1300, silk manufacturing factories, indeed, were already up and running in places such as Egypt and Grenada and elsewhere. So silk making was happening here also. And finally, there was a form of treatment of copper and alloy castings, which suggests a kind of currency with what today we might call alchemy. Not only the separation of minerals, one from the other, but in, for example, this very small, it's about 2.5 inches tall, mace head showing Janus heads, one a youthful figure, the other an elder. It's punched heavily with arsenic. And so that would have meant this was probably a death maul of some sort. So I think the addition of arsenic would have reinforced that death-evoking quality, but it suggests that one is able to extract arsenic and copper in doing this. And of course, the two minerals appear together in nature, but the fact that this is so much heavier in its arsenic content suggests that this was happening. And in other cases, roughly half of the life-size heads are pure copper, and roughly the other half are copper with various alloys. There are major differences in how they look and how they would have been handled in the casting process. The other thing that I think is important here is the relationship between Ife itself and the major site across the Niger River that allowed one to reach the other side. It's a massive river with a lot of cliffside areas, so there are very few points where you can actually cross it. And one of the major ones is at the site of Tada and a nearby island site of Jebba. And those two sites is where a number of 14th century objects were found that are closely linked with Ife and with this broader culture. And among the objects that are here was this beautiful seated figure, nearly life-size if it were to be stood up, cast of pure copper and used in ceremonies along the river. A standing figure on the left I'll be speaking about shortly that might have been made just slightly after the other one. And then two remarkable figures, one clearly made from life of a baby elephant on the right, and the other two ostriches, which call to mind 1300 the importance of ivory in trade, the importance of ivory to Europe and elsewhere, and where this ivory may have been coming from. This would have been one of several places. But one of the theories about the development of complex political systems in Africa is that the ivory trade may have played an important role. Put it this way, you don't want to go hunting elephants alone, particularly without a rifle, and there were none at that point. So you need a community to do it, and you need a means to stake out the terrain, a mountainous area, valleys that you can put barriers on so that you can fell the elephant. So one of the theories is that complex kingships in part developed out of this, out of control of these regions and the ability to develop this kind of network of communities who would combine. And then you have to decide who's going to get the ivory and benefit from that material exchange. What we generally don't talk about is the importance of ostrich feathers, which were the fashion thing in Europe. And frankly, if I had to choose a market to get involved with, I would much prefer ostrich feathers. They're lightweight. The ostriches can regrow them, and you can simply put them in your bag and take them to Europe. So Europeans can do wonderful, funny things with them, such as in this Basel engraving. So it was a major trade center, and I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the science of metallurgy, and to simply say that we don't know an awful lot. The current theory is that the copper and some of the trace minerals in the Ife bronzes came possibly from Germany, or at least possibly from Europe, and then came around and was transported probably by way of Andalusia across the Sahara and into this part of West Africa. Indeed, we found camel caravans with copper on it, so we know that the camels had died and it had been sort of lost in the Sahara. On the other hand, the analysis of this copper, particularly for these heads, has been really, really problematic. And so we don't know, and there also is the ability of having the likelihood that there were also local copper mines in this part of Nigeria. So until we know more, we simply cannot say that the copper from Ife came from elsewhere. And I'm more inclined to believe that it was local, at least until we have really clear scientific evidence elsewhere. But here we can get, I think, into some of the more specific and vital elements of trade that make me really begin to think that there was something more happening to it. This wonderful standing figure that you see here in the middle of perhaps 1325 or a little bit later has certainly a style of manufacturing that is reminiscent of other works from Ife. But part of the garment is so different that is being associated with it, and even the diadem on the crown of the face, that I have no doubt, but that it has in part a foreign source. And we have some evidence that textiles and robes were coming into this area. And I think one of the most interesting are things that were fashioned perhaps after the coronation robe of the Holy Roman Emperor, again around the same time, 1300. We see on this robe birds with sort of snaky wings. You can see that in the upper right. You get cross forms, equilateral cross forms, and other elements, the bands that come down across the chest, etc. And this same style of garment, much sort of transformed, is part of the attire that is worn by a masquerade figure associated with the ancestors of the king of Ida, the Igala king, who control that key river crossing area. And so it seems as if here too there's a kind of complementarity. And Coptic textiles were and are world known, so it is quite possible that one of these textiles, a robe, if nothing more, arrived by way of trade. But we have other evidence as well, and here I'll turn to Leo Africanus, who's writing in the early 16th century of meeting in some part of this broader area that scholars have written dissertations on, and we're still not quite sure where it was, but the kingdom of Gauga, that I'll talk about shortly, of meeting here a very wealthy trader from Cairo who had come with magnificent gifts, and he's coming from the town of the city of Damietta, which is on the coast, and it's the major trading site for textiles coming from Asia through to Egypt and elsewhere, and it's also a major center for textile manufacturing. But he's leaving with this king a gallant horse, Turkish swords, and a kingly robe. What that robe looked like, we don't know, but we do know that there was value in kingly robes. And here I'm simply pointing out the importance of robes and other kinds of attire for people like the patriarch, the Coptic patriarch. Gauga, where it was, is not clear. It appears in a playing card as a major center from this circa 1600 playing card. It's probably in this area around Lake Chad, which is on an east-west route that's going between Lake Chad, the Niger River, and the Nile. And one can see in the arts of Ife itself, dated to around 1300, some other reflections that there may have been garments arriving in here, particularly stoles, which were so important for the Eastern Christian priesthood, and very different from the kinds of attire that royals and others were wearing, as we can see through the terracotta and bronze castings from this period. And that's not the only textile or textile references that we can see in this area. The other is a kind of vertical loom textile that is associated today exclusively with an association of very powerful, very wealthy men who are the kingmakers in this area, the so-called Ogboni Association. And they wear a kind of cloth with tassels at the bottom, with looping elements, which is very, very similar in the fabric of the textile itself, which is very similar to Coptic textiles. And again, tassels are not the sort of thing that one is finding in sub-Saharan Africa. And this famous king, Obalufon II, who was the major patron of the arts, in Ife, ruling around the same period of time, responsible in that period for a new city plan, for trade, and for bronze casting. Today's identified as also the god of textiles, so we can assume that he had a role in that as well. And so here too, I think we have further evidence of this. Those of you who know anything about Yoruba and Hausa textiles might well recognize the garment on the right as a Hausa agbada gown, similar to those that elite Yoruba men wear today and Hausa men. Indeed, it's neither. This is a Coptic robe from the 8th century, made in the form of a T with this wonderful asymmetrical spiral on it, very reminiscent of the kinds of things that were done in the 20th century and earlier by Hausa and Yoruba artists. And you'll note too the inclusion of both cotton and silk in these cloths, again part of this trade. We find also in Ife the use of stone, quartz in particular vessels. We don't find these elsewhere for the most part in Africa, but there is a kind of complement with the kind of alabaster urns we see in places such as Egypt or in trade centers in Sudan such as Karga. And then we have the really unusual and really extraordinary pavements of Ile-Ife. There are literally thousands of them. It's impossible to walk over the whole site of Ife. It's today a center of about 150,000 people. In its fluorescent era, it probably had about 30,000 people, perhaps the size of Paris at the time. But these majestic pavements made out of stones, different colored stones, and pottery fragments, sherds that are laid upright in the earth and very closely tied, that have endured nearly 700 years. We're just not seeing pavements of this sort elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what's the source for this? It certainly could be Roman. Romans were definitely doing pavements, but this does not have a Roman feel to it. Indeed, the closest parallels that I've seen are in the kind of reconstruction of the Jerusalem court and the importance of Jerusalem as a center for Coptic religion. And one could well imagine that ideas from Jerusalem in particular may have made their way back here. And if you look at it, you can see, an X form or a cross form that's part of it. The other thing that I think is quite striking in this area is that Ile-Ife and Yoruba city-states more generally, this is historically a very urban area going back a long period of time, are central planned walled cities. That means that there's a wall surrounding them with basically two main avenues coming in east-west and north-south, each leading to a different trade center. In the very heart of the city is the palace, the principal temple, and the principal market, so that there's control of trade. And why a walled city? Defense certainly would be part of it, but Ife is surrounded by the equivalent of a moat. There's a spring-fed water area all around it, so you really don't need that at all. Most of the argument that's done for walled cities in Africa, this part of Africa, is that they're for trade reasons. When you have four main gates, you control everything that comes into the city and goes out. And you can collect taxes, which are going to be important for large building projects. This, of course, is not the first place you're going to have central planned walled cities. Some of the earliest ones are from circa 1250, 1300 in the so-called Bastides in the area of Spain and France, a center of cross-currency between Christians and Muslims. The origins of this, I have no idea. It's crossing over Europe and the Middle East around this time and earlier. But the image of heavenly Jerusalem that could have been transported by way of manuscripts and other means is also sort of similar to a circular city of this sort. And so is the division of the city of Ife into quadrants, each for a different dynasty, and each identified with different sets but of complementary art in reflection of the two dynasties that held primacy and still do today in Ile-Ife. And we could go on. I would simply show you Hausa armor in the British Museum, 18th, 19th century, and it would fool me. I would never even imagine that this were Nigerian armor, and clearly has sources from elsewhere. Is it Muslim? Is it Coptic? It's not entirely clear, but the male and other elements of it suggest that there was something here that was coming as well. And if we think about Christianity, we're thinking about a number of things. Certainly a set of beliefs, certainly a set of military figures with a degree of military power and prowess. And we can see references to this in the armies of Karga and Nubia, as well as the importance ultimately of trade. Cavalry would have been part of this too. And the figure from Jebba is wearing a kind of armor that may be a reflection of this. But let's think about the broader geography and what this might mean ultimately about Ile-Ife and this broader area. The map on the upper left is actually a rendering that was made after Leo Africanus. And it goes from Nigeria, which is at the bottom, and then up and across. And I would simply ask you, if there's nothing happening between Nigeria and the Nile, why would you have to have 5 powerful kingdoms controlling that area? The Muslims are saying at this time that nobody should take that route because it is too dangerous. My belief is that the reason it's so dangerous is because it's not controlled by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's controlled by a different group, and in all likelihood that is the area that was controlled by Copts in this period and in later centuries. And you can see in the map on the left the importance of this east-west route as well. And things are coming over. And Ray Silverman's going to be talking about Mamluk vessels, such as the one here and found in northern Nigeria. And yes, they could have been transported across the Sahara, but they also could have been transported along with these robes down the Nile and reached their destination by this means as well. So let's talk about maps in particular. And let me just say that in the same way that if I'm setting up a trading company, I would much prefer trading ostrich feathers to elephant tusks. I would also far prefer making that trade east-west from the Niger River to the Nile, then up the Nile to the Mediterranean or across the Nile to the Red Sea and going further to the east, simply because what you're seeing in the map on the right, this is that GIS mapping system that I helped develop. But each of those yellow dots represents a wadi. And what is a wadi? It's a spring. It's part of a riverine area that stays heavily moist, at least through part of the year. And this was once what was known as the Yellow Nile. So it's a tributary of the Nile that remains very moist. You can walk across it on foot. You can take horses or anything else, and it would be far preferable and even far less long than doing the incredibly difficult trans-Saharan route with all of the work it would take to get the camel train together with all of the food and the water and everything else it would need to cross the Sahara, and all of the dangers that are involved in that, including, sandstorms and everything else. And I would simply say that the medievals were great at mapping. We tend to completely dismiss them, but in many respects, they had a far greater sense of what was actually happening on the ground in the middle of Nigeria than the travelers who, for the most part, after the Portuguese come around the coast in 1450 and later, and even under the era of scientific cartography, are only going to the coast. They're not going inland at all. And to the medievals, and going back even earlier, to the Ravenna cosmography of circa 700, you'll see a river going east-west across the middle of Africa. And in a certain sense, I would argue that river across the belt of Africa is the Niger River. It was only in the 19th century, and after a huge purse was put up, that one actually discovered the source of the Niger River. For a long period of time, half the people thought it traveled from west to east, meaning from Senegal over to the middle of Nigeria and then down to the delta. The other half thought it traveled east to west. It's really hard for anybody who follows a river to get the direction of its water flow wrong. But in fact, what you're looking at here is the Benue tributary and the Niger River itself, both massive rivers. And the Benue tributary, which is on the right part of the year, feeds into Lake Chad. So you can actually take it as a single waterway. And then from there, you're following this relatively water-rich route. And just to provide you with a couple of other references, I particularly like the Hereford Mappamundi, same time period, circa 1300. And again, because while it does suggest that one is thinking about this part of the world as populated by strange beings, it also suggests that you have this great waterway. And to what extent is one learning about strange beings from things such as the kinds of masks and other attire that people are wearing in this region? And you can see some of these other maps as well, sort of trying to get at this east-west connection by water. And I think if we think about trafficking today, they're following the same routes that they were following earlier. And here we're talking about human trafficking and ivory and drugs, et cetera, et cetera. That east-west route is absolutely critical and would continue to be for a long period of time going back into the past. So a few months ago, I found some new evidence that, maybe 5 or 6 months, that I think adds another dimension to this. It had been published earlier, but in the Sudanese site, in this area very close to one of the major trade centers, there apparently was a Frenchman around this 13th or 14th century named Benessac, who carved his name in a Coptic temple. Basically, Benessac came to pay homage to Raphael. It sounds like a movie out of Hollywood in some way. Raphael was one of the healing saints at this site. So we have evidence of some kind of European, probably French, could have been Catalan, arriving here and leaving his signature. And then not far away was a French or Catalan playing card. And it's in the British Museum. It's a woodblock playing card. Here, very similar to the deck on the right. If you're traveling, what more do you want but a chisel and a set of playing cards? But equally interesting, and who this man was, we certainly don't know. It was a major period of contestation over Christian and Muslim sites. There certainly are Templars and others fighting in places such as Syria. Someone's taken captive by the Mamluks in Cairo. A good fighter, what are you going to do with them? My sense would be I would send them down the Nile to some of these areas that are more difficult to control, and maybe, as in the Mamluks, who were enslaved individuals in their own right, who rose through the army ranks, somebody gained freedom and wrote his name in the temple. Who knows how he got there? But there are other things that are interesting in this same Banganardi site in southern Nubia. You get these strange wells with decoration at the bottom, which more likely are not wells at all, but cisterns, so that you can notice the rise of the water levels, not inconsistent with what's happening on the Nile itself. You get pavements, you get veneer stone architecture, and you get structures with niches in them, probably Christian temples, and you get chalices. This was a healing center, and we've got evidence of various people, Muslims and others, who are going to this area, to this center, because of what it's offering by way of healing. What could make maybe more of the kinds of facial markings that are found here, which are quite similar to some of those in Nigeria. Is it a question of enslavement or otherwise? Certainly slaves and ivory were among the things that went east to west. And then we have these amazing garments that are shown on the murals, garments with strange birds and horned headdresses and the like. Again, somewhat reflective of the kinds of things that we're seeing in this stunning Tata figure from Nigeria of 1300. And again, garments travel relatively quickly. But there's also an even closer parallel, not far from Lake Chad itself, where there's evidence of bricks. So these would have been baked bricks, hard bricks, and then the building of structures with them. There's a central planned walled city that was here. It's an area right now very difficult to work because of the political situation. But you see complements there. And then in a remarkable site, which is an overlook mountain, really very tall, that directly overlooks the passage from Lake Chad down to the Benue River. some other remarkable things were discovered that scholars have not really been able to identify. And this is the so-called DGB sites of the Mandara Mountains, where we have veneer stone architecture, niches, chalices, and then these kind of wells where in the bottom of them were found sand and seashells. Again, who knows what they were used for, but I would suggest probably that they were more likely kinds of cisterns. And why would you want cisterns? Well, on a hill, you would want it to keep water to last you through the year, but you're also looking at the amount of rain that has come at the course of the spring rain, so that you can determine when to plant and what the season is going to basically, how the season is going to bear out. So I'm simply showing you here the comparisons of the DGB sites and the sites in Sudan, from chalices, veneer stone architecture, cisterns, niches, etc. And to point to what else is happening here that's so remarkable, as I mentioned, this is a place of major importance militarily, if for nothing else. The sight lines here are really remarkable. You control this site and you control this whole larger area of trade coming from Lake Chad down. And this is the area here that, I can go. Here are the sight lines that are controlling from, I did some GIS mapping, and you can see how that is controlling it here. And then sort of the last piece of it that really stunned me, when you're doing GIS mapping, you can overlay different sets of maps. And I'm looking through, because what else does one do at night but looking through maps of Africa on the web? I found this remarkable one of Y-DNA R1b, which positions in this very heart of Africa a trait following along the male line that is very similar to what one finds in places such as Spain and France, Ireland, etc. And it's not only striking here, but also it's striking because the heart, the most condensed part of this is right at the DGB sites. And so my thinking is that at some point, 12th, 13th century, someone, probably of European ancestry, is coming over from the Nile to gain control of these areas. If you go to this area, these people look like anyone else in Nigeria or Cameroon or whatever, but the Y-DNA stuck. And so it's a small, hilltop community. And so between intermarriage, et cetera, this has been retained in the family. And it does suggest that there was some outside impact. And I think what's particularly striking here, I've spoken with DNA specialists, and particularly those who are mapping the human genome, and what they indicated, this particular strand of DNA has to be after 2500 BCE. This would mean it's not part of the original migration out of Africa to Europe. So that also helps us define it. And I'm only showing this in this context because this is the heartland of Boko Haram today. This is that really vicious, incredibly difficult Islamicist center that's doing so much of this illicit trade and enslavement, etc. And of course, they're going to want to control this critical area between Chad and Cameroon and Nigeria. But there's other evidence. There's a Coptic calendar, which is used in the Hausa area of Nigeria, the same calendar that's used along the Nile. There's also elements of a kind of Coptic language within the language of Hausa for particular kinds of forms. So you've got language and calendrical systems. You've got the impact of textiles. If we look again at the garment of this figure, you've got gorgons that are being included in these works. You've got sirens with splayed feet that are turning up in Nigeria around this time. And my guess, they're happening, of course, more broadly in Europe, but particularly along key trade routes. It's reminiscent of the reflection of the classical past sort of reinvented in the medieval period to address the difficulties of trade. And whether it's with Perseus or otherwise, they're often included in these circles which have interlooping elements around the perimeter, which is identical to what's happening at the top. So I think it's probably in part through textiles that these are coming. And the other thing that's being circulated that's somewhat strange, and again has been the bane of existence for many Africanists, is some beliefs about pharaonic Egypt. So that the dead are placed on canoes, for example, and there's a kind of local system of mummification. And my guess is that what is happening, and there's a term for it that is used in the context of medieval Coptic traditions that for the most part has been turned aside at this moment in time. But one of the things that I think that the medieval Copts were offering to other parts of Africa at this time is a kind of legacy of pharaonic belief, to the extent that you assume an identity with this particular group, and your line, your lineage would live forever, or your line, your lineage would have enormous dynastic power, like the kings of Egypt. They're controlling the trade, and again, this particular association called it Boni. And I think what's also happening is that they're circulating Nubian grave goods. So around 1300, there's a massive drought in Egypt, and you've got major contestation between Muslims and Christians in this point as well. And I think at a certain point, a lot of people are just leaving and going west. But one of the things that one is finding on Ife terracottas and in other bronzes are references to these Nubian shield rings that have the form of a ram god, Khnum, who was the god associated with dynastic origins, but also with the origins of rain and water on the Nile. And you can see the same kind of wearing of a pendant in the form of a ram that you can see in the Tata figure. You can see Courtaulds, again, not an African motif, but found in these forms. And I think what is happening is that ideas, certainly you have kingship and dynasty well before this, but a link to a particular kind of power that is coming through this quote-unquote Christian or Coptic trade element that I think is especially keen. And again, as one is thinking about this, you can think about what is being traded and why. And these historic materials, I think, are particularly interesting to think about from the vantage point of gold and trade goods. If you go to this area today and do interviews, you'll find beautiful wall paintings, and sometimes the priests will tell you that they're like hieroglyphics. People read, so who knows what that means, but I think that idea of a legacy of a language that was written, there's a tradition here, a history here, that at a certain point in time, the Ife residents basically burned all the books, and they went back to their native belief. Now, what were the books? They could have been Korans. It could be an indication of Jewish identity here. It could be the Bible, but there was a strong sense that at some point they wanted to turn to themselves. But I think the legacy of this has continued, and I think we can see it in other traditions as well, including the site of Igbo Ukwu, where we get these great bronze vessels that are wrapped in cord, quite similar to the kinds of things that are happening along the Nile. So just to conclude, I think that there's an awful lot of evidence that suggests that there was something here in this part of Africa that was happening, something that connects it deeply with the Coptic and Christian traditions that are particularly part of the culture of the Nile. And there was communication and ideas going in both directions. And I also think that as part of this, we also have to rethink not only the importance of this as a center for manufacturing and for an incredible production of art, but realize that these arts, there's nothing like them in Europe at this time. And that their importance, therefore, stands in its own right, even as we are beginning to think about the impacts of some of these goods coming in and how they may have encouraged local artists to think about things in a new way. How about the crown of the Ife monarch? Are there similarities with what one is seeing elsewhere, including the engagement with red feathers? And then we have a whole array of things, from bells, I've kind of listed them here, bells and mail, robes and gorgons, we could say sirens and mosaic pavements, caves, cloth, chalices, crotalds, tassels, silk, fashion courts, central planned walled cities, trade routes, DNA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is, in the end, an incredibly important center and a way of thinking about the world in a new light. And if I had the time, and so this is my last comment on this, I believe that these gold funerary goods are also probably traveling to Europe from Nubia. And in the same way that they may have been one of the sources for new interest in naturalism in Ife, who knows but whether it was the goldsmiths who were melting down gold and certainly were part of the initial turn toward naturalism in Europe in these goldsmith shops. Who knows but what these also had an impact elsewhere. Thank you.